The thin blue line has finally reached the breaking point. What happened in Baltimore leaves a nation wondering how law enforcement got to this point, meaning we have to examine emboldened criminals, cops who could be turning less effective in their jobs, and the possibility of creating a federal police force with new rules and regulations. I'm Ed Berliner. Our job is to never fear the questions or the answers. This is MidPoint.
Freddie Gray's screams can be heard on this cell phone video that CBS station WJZ obtained from his family. It shows white Baltimore police officers lifting and carrying Gray, his feet dragging on the ground. 30 minutes later, after the van arrived at a nearby police station, someone called an ambulance. By then, Gray was critically injured. His lawyer says Gray's spine was 80% severed at his neck, his voice box partially crushed. After being in a coma for a week, the 27-year-old died on Sunday.
Our guests speak from both sides of this issue. She is the former L.A. Police Department sergeant who knows the streets, what works and what doesn't. Also author of Black and Blue, The Creation of a Manifesto. Always a pleasure to welcome back Cheryl Dorsey. And he is retired from the U.S. Air Force and a tireless supporter of transparency in law enforcement investigations. After his son was killed by a police officer, with the review of that case not even close to Air Force investigative standards. It's a pleasure to welcome back Mike Bell. I thank you both for being here today.
Thank you.
Hi, Ed. Thank you.
Sergeant Dorsey, I'm going to start with you in what is a story that is coming out today out of New York. A federal monitor overseeing reforms to the NYPD. They have issued brand new rules for basic Cop 101 advice. Simple things like don't intimidate the speech or don't imitate the speech of others. Don't target certain races because they appear more often in local crime stats. But the big story here is, Sergeant Dorsey, they talk about federal monitoring. Are we reaching a stage in law enforcement in this country where we may have to one day think about, and very soon think about, a federal police force?
Well, you know, Ed, I believe that we need to really give that some serious consideration because we cannot trust police departments to police themselves. We see officers doing things that are egregious, that are in violation of policy, and in some instances violating the law. And then we have police chiefs and sheriffs who want to stand up before a bank of cameras and try to justify something that's unjustifiable. So we can't depend on them to be honest and truthful.
But why would we trust a federal law enforcement more than local law enforcement? Because, again, aren't we talking about the need for local law enforcement, people on the ground who understand the local communities?
Well, because we need a set of unbiased eyes, someone who doesn't have a dog in the fight. You know, we talk about needing independent prosecutor, right? Someone who doesn't work hand in hand with the police department day to day and have relationships that would maybe cause them to not be unbiased in their final reporting. And so, you know, this is serious, Ed. I mean, we're almost a murder a week here of a young person. And so we need a clear, unbiased reviewer of facts.
Lieutenant Colonel Bell, let me take it to you. We've talked before about having that independent review board, but what about your thinking process with regard to having a federal monitor, first of all, and then perhaps making it a federal police force? I got news for you. That'll scare an awful lot of people.
I don't think the country is ready for a federal police force, but I do believe that the country would be ready for a federal monitor. You just need to look at the aviation industry as a model. We have the National Transportation Safety Board. It takes a look at all the major airlines, it handles their mishaps, and then it comes down with rulings. And nobody ever questions the trustworthiness of the National Transportation Safety Board. I think that we are ready for that.
What would make anybody believe that a federal organization could be less graft-filled, if you will, less subjected to perhaps just making deals for certain cops than local law enforcement would?
I would have to say that there are independent review. There are good cops out there. I mean, just take a look at what happened in Ohio there with the Skidder incident. There are good cops, and we have to trust them, but it's the good cops that won't speak up. They're the quiet majority. So I think that just like in the aviation industry, you have good people that are appointed by a high-ranking elected official that have established a credibility, and they can make decisions on the matter.
I've only got about 45 seconds left before we take a break, and this will almost be a preview of what we're going to talk about after the commercial break here. Sergeant Dorsey, in Baltimore, the case there. Do we need, and again, are we waiting then maybe for an honest cop to come forward and tell us what happened?
Listen, here's what we need to do for those good cops that are out there that are seeing egregious things happen on a, almost seem like a daily basis. We need to protect them because understand that any police officer who comes forward has a price to pay administratively. And so we need to protect those whistleblowers so that they will speak out to the atrocities that we're starting to see.
But aren't we really trying to protect them now? I mean, supposedly cops who come forward right now are protected.
Well, you can say what you want, but I can tell you in a real world situation that there's a price to pay if you speak about things that go on, whether it's just your partners, whether it's the rest of the officers on your shift, or whether it's administration who will come after you, take you out of a coveted position, remove you from your rank. And so officers are not going to speak out because they're the breadwinners a lot of the times. And they can't afford to have.
All right, Sergeant, I'm going to ask you to hold
ability.
on just one moment. We're right up against the clock. We're going to come back and talk about the changing law enforcement culture right here on MidPoint.
Knowing backup was on its way, Officer Kidder kept backpedaling while the suspect insisted Officer Kidder shoot him.
I was trying to open a dialogue with him, I don't want to shoot you, just get on the ground, but he wasn't having it. He just kept repeating, shoot me. At one point, he said, shoot me or I'll shoot you.
Then the suspect charged.
And he got towards my face right as I lost balance. I'm thinking at this point that if he goes in to attack me, that I will have to use deadly force to defend myself.
Back to work with retired LAPD Sergeant Cheryl Dorsey, joined by retired Air Force Colonel and responsible law enforcement activist Mike Bell. I'm going to talk about Baltimore in a minute, but first of all, let me address specifically what happened here in New Richmond, Ohio, where Jesse Kidder, the officer, could have opened fire on a man. He talked him down, did not fire a shot. Mike Bell, to you first, though. There are some who look at this and are concerned that perhaps, just perhaps, cops are going to start waiting a little too long. They're going to be a little, not itchy trigger finger, but exactly the opposite. They're going to take far too much time then to do their job and to protect the population. What do you think?
Well, first off, I got to give a shout out to Officer Kidder. I've never been more proud of an officer. There have been some very heroic deeds like that here in Wisconsin. I called down to that department. I tried to talk to the chief. I was very proud of them. That's a decision that's going to have to be made on an individual basis. Everybody knows what their limits are. And when I was flying an airplane, I knew what my limits are too. And I think Officer Kidder knew his limits, and that's why he acted the way he did.
Sergeant Dorsey, I guess that comes to you then, because knowing full well that the cop on the beat faces these decisions every single day, those split-second choices. Are we getting to a point where so much is happening and the bad cops might force the good cops at this sense to stop, to think twice, 3 times, 4 times, and that could possibly hurt themselves or somebody else?
I don't agree with that, Ed, and I applaud that officer. He made a judgment call, and I certainly don't second-guess him. He obviously had a plan that if he did have to use deadly force, which should be a last resort and not a first resort, then he would do that. And so he opted to use deadly force in this instance as a last resort, and there were options. And it involved some vulgarity, and it involved some harsh language to the suspect. But guess what? It worked, and the guy lived, and the officer was safe. So I applaud his decision in that regard.
Is that what we're getting to here? And that maybe is what we're seeing far too often here, Sergeant Dorsey, is the fact that force, if you will, that lethal force is the first thing a lot of the cops look forward to now.
Well, that's what I see, Ed. Immediate defense of life. That's when you're authorized to use deadly force. That doesn't mean that if you're running after somebody and you can't catch them, that you get to use deadly force. If you're not in immediate defense of your life or the life of someone else, then you need to pull something else out of your bag of tricks beside a firearm.
Lieutenant Colonel Mike Bell, to you then on this. And the bag of tricks, I guess, is the next thing. That speaks to me right away here. What else after a while, you're going to find cops saying, I'm out of tricks at this point. The only recourse I have left is to shoot.
And that's absolutely right. One of the things I really liked about this whole situation is that people are arguing against the body cam, but I think the body cam showed in this a successful experience with an officer and a suspect. I mean, that officer had the right lawfully to shoot that suspect, but he didn't need to for necessity. And that's why I think and you could take this and you bring it to the academy and you can train young cadets on what this officer did. And so that way they've already pre-thought this type of scenario in their head so that when they are placed in that scenario themselves, they know how they want to react.
Oddly enough, a body camera that was bought by his family for him after the Michael Brown shooting in Ferguson and not by the police department. I got about 90 seconds left. Lieutenant Colonel, to Baltimore. Is perhaps the most distressing thing about what happened in Baltimore is that something we have to assume, and we know how dangerous that is, but we have to assume something happened inside that van, because it would seem that that's the focus here right now. And the fact that it's taken a couple of days and we still don't know, somebody's hiding something.
You know, and I understand that. And the thing is that the aviation industry has a backup reporting system that you could use anonymously. It's called the Aviation Safety and Reporting System. It's implemented by NASA. And NASA then sends its finding to the FAA. In my recommendations to the 21st Century Task Force on Policing, that was a model that I suggested be activated across the United States, so that way if an officer wants to bring this forward, they won't put their career in jeopardy and they won't put other careers in jeopardy. And this type of thing might have helped the situation in Baltimore.
45 seconds, Sergeant Dorsey. Do you believe, with your experience, that indeed somebody's hiding something, they know what happened, and something happened in that van?
Oh, Ed, absolutely. I mean, it's just heart-wrenching to think that that young man was pleading for his life one moment and in a coma the next. You don't wind up with a severed spine and a broken lung or a fractured leg, whatever other injuries he had by happenstance. Someone caused those injuries, and so we need to find out who, and they need to be held responsible.
And if the Baltimore Police Department was actually right out in front of this, they probably should have said something within a day or so. Here we are 2 days later, and the longer it takes, the more people are going to wonder about what they are hiding. Sergeant Dorsey, Lieutenant Colonel Bell, always a pleasure to talk to you, both of you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Ed.
Thank you, Ed.
All right, take care. Open the gates to the arena next as American warships sit on the edge of a possible naval shooting war with plenty of itchy trigger fingers surrounding them off the coast of Yemen. We may again be facing a war that we didn't want. MidPoint continues.